Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're very excited to be meeting with you all this afternoon to talk about fast test creation. So I'm Mary Kate Morrison. I'm one of the customer success managers here at Mabel, and I work alongside our customers to help make sure they have a smooth adoption of Mabel within their organization and ultimately ensure that they're successful in achieving their goals and objectives and implementing our solution.
And hello all, my name's Damon Paul. I'm been with Mabel for a little bit over a year now, currently as the technical solutions engineer. Before Mabel, I was a manual QA tester and a QA automation tester, which means that I have a lot of experience in the QA world that I'm able to apply and kind of help our customers with either through the support chat or through any of the trainings that I help facilitate.
Great. So our plan for today and our learning objectives you can see here on the screen are we're going to cover how you can maximize your efficiency in creating tests by using flows. We'll talk about how you can scale a single test to cover a ton of different scenarios using data-driven testing, as well as we'll review some strategies and recommendations to really focus your test to get more value quickly. So let's go ahead and dive into flows. So for those that may be unfamiliar, a flow groups steps together that accomplish a specific action. And once a flow is made, it can easily be added into any test that needs to accomplish that same action. And then one of the biggest benefits is that anytime you need to update a flow, you only have to make updates in one instance of it, and those changes will synchronize across all tests using that flow. So flows really aid in fast test creation in a number of ways. First, which some of you may be familiar with, creating flows aligns with the dry principle or don't repeat yourself. So they eliminate the need to recreate the same steps in every test you're building in Mabel, as well as they remove any duplicated work within your team, since flows are shared across all users within a workspace. And given updates needed only have to be made within a single instance of a flow, it makes them very easy to maintain over time as well. So we're going to dive into a couple really practical use cases of flows now.
Yeah, so first one is the concept of variable creation. Now, for anyone that has written automated tests before, you know that managing the data that your test uses can be very important. And oftentimes, if you're filling out forms or something similar, you may need to generate some randomized data. Now, utilizing faker.js that's built directly into Mabel, as well as a flow, you can see here an example of a flow that automatically creates a first name, last name, phone number, and street address for a fake person. Now, I can think of many instances in which this kind of data would be useful. So by grouping it into a flow, I then have sped up the actual process of creating that randomized data and it allows me to just import this anytime I need it. Parameterized flows. Now, if you've attended any of our other sessions, you've heard a lot about flows and parameterized flows. I want to speak specifically to the speed aspect of it from around test creation. Now, compared to making a normal flow, it'll actually take a little bit longer to create a flow that is parameterized. But one of the biggest value pieces here, and thinking of it from the speed standpoint, is what that one flow is then able to be utilized in multiple different scenarios going through the same actions. So thinking of a flow, it defines a certain set of steps, but if you're able to change what data is used each time that that flow is actually implemented, it means you're able to keep more steps in sync across all of your tests, but able to vary the different situations in which that one flow does work.
Great, thanks for those examples, Damon. So just to recap, remember that flows are very powerful for helping you create tests quickly by allowing you to save sets of steps that you'll be reusing across many tests in Mabel. So to dive into data-driven testing now. So data-driven testing in Mabel is the process of loading data that is external to your test to allow for testing multiple data inputs across a single test. So it's really powerful for speeding up test creation for several reasons. One, it's reusable. So tests can be written once and executed over and over by simply changing or iterating on the data inputs. It also allows for stronger test coverage because you can quickly add or change your input data to cover different paths throughout a single test. And another thing that makes it so useful is that it really allows for a clean separation between your test case logic and your test data. So we'll further unpack data tables and how to use them now.
Perfect. So starting off with data tables, what is a data table? If you see on the right-hand side here, this is an example of what a data table will look like inside of Mabel. Um, what you're actually defining here using the different columns, which are the variables that would exist in your test, and the rows, which are different scenarios, are basically different sets of data that you want to execute one test with. Here's an example. So if you think about wanting to validate logging in, right? Maybe you want to create a smoke test that logs in as your different types of users. With the power of a data table, we can define multiple sets of credentials that one might use to actually then create one test with. So if I have this data-driven variable, the data-driven variables of password and username, my test then goes in and inserts the value into the email field, inserts the value into the password, logs in, and then I can validate that I was able to successfully log in. Because we only have to write that test once. And then where where the increased value and speed really comes in here is the ability to actually take that one test and provide different sets of data. So if I've got an admin user and a standard user and maybe a manager that all have different have different roles within Mabel, I can actually create a I can create a test that tries to log in as each type. Then let's say we add in some extra new type of user. Instead of going and having to add a whole nother test, all we have to do is add in a singular row. And now we've expanded upon our test coverage to include that new user type. This works for many different scenarios. Think things like searching in your application and validating that certain results come back. There's a lot of different ways of utilizing data-driven testing to actually speed that up. One of the other really nice benefits is when you actually start making that test by associating the data table with it, instead of having to create all the variables in the process of actually creating the test, they all are pre-populated inside the actual trainer itself. So you can hit the ground running with predefined variable values that you set up ahead of time.
Awesome. So just to reiterate once more, data-driven testing is a really great way to test a lot of different scenarios through this test. So we'll move into focusing your test now. So we want to talk through some recommendations for ways you can focus your tests. So not only you can create them quickly, but you'll also see other benefits when you think about ongoing maintenance and review time. So we'll walk through a few strategies for creating shorter focus tests. And by having shorter focus tests with less steps, they're going to be faster to edit and maintain over time, as well as you're ultimately able to get more value from your test executions because they're going to run faster and they'll be simpler to review from a test output standpoint. And by shortening that review time, more of your time can be freed up to create more tests in Mabel and focus on other priorities. So we'll dive into 3 concepts we really want you to consider to help create focus tests.
So starting off, these are a couple tips and different ways to think about making a more focused test. Now, this is one of the ways it may seem slightly counterintuitive, some of what we're going to be talking about, because some of it may take a little bit longer. But one of the real value points is that it's kind of a slow down to speed up. There's a lot of value that you can get out of these tests. So keep all of that in mind as we go through this. The first one is a visit URL step. Anytime that you make a brand new test in Mabel, you'll automatically see a visit URL step at the beginning of your test. Once you go past maybe let's say your login, there's one thing that you can do is actually add another visit URL step. One example of this might be, let's say that I was actually talking to someone earlier that was working on a product and they had to test a checkout flow. And within that checkout flow, there's a couple different points in which they might want to test. Now, there's a couple ways to get to, let's say, an item that they want to validate and then add that to their cart. If they're not testing the navigation to get to that item, they just want to test putting that in the cart. By adding in a visit URL step, they can directly visit that specific item that they want to add and then do that actual action that they're trying to test. Um, Thinking also on something like focused assertions. I've seen in the time that I've been on our support queue, a lot of people will make tests where they assert almost every item of text on a page. And that can be very valuable if you're trying to make sure that text isn't changing on that page. But if you're just visiting that page as part of a user flow, maybe asserting on all that text isn't what you're really trying to get out of with that test. So if it's unrelated to what you're testing, maybe skip it. Make sure that if an assertion fails, it's really going to tell you something about the action that you're trying to make and the focus that you're really trying to have on this test. If the focus, to use the previous example, if the test is to add an item to a cart and make sure you can do that correctly, by validating that the UI showed up on the search page to get there, not as useful. And the final tip is the concept of generating data, and I'm going to speak to it specifically through an API step. Using something like generated data can be a really powerful way to also skip some of that previous navigation that I was referencing, but also always make sure that your data is really focused and concise. So, as an example, another customer that I was working with had to create orders, and these orders would be a draft order, and an order could either be edited, it could be deleted, or it could be filled. Now, to actually create those tests, what they ended up doing was they would go in through the UI, create an order first each time, and then proceed with those actions. One of the big pieces to note here is that if by being able to just generate that data via an API call, they were able to start their tests right on a draft order and skip that whole process at the beginning where they were creating the order in the first place. It allowed the test to run faster, and it allowed it to be a much shorter, more concise, more focused test itself. Now, thinking about um, some of the other points that we were talking about, here's an example also of that actual visit URL step in action. So thinking of for this specific event that we were facilitating, we wanted to make sure that no one had any issues actually registering for the event. If you see the test on the left, we went through some of the navigation that was on our site, got to the actual page, and then clicked on that register for free action. Now, if our navigation changed or if there were multiple ways of getting to this page, we would need to create multiple tests that went through that whole flow. But instead, we decided to create a test that focused on just the actual registration aspect of it, so that no matter how someone got to that page, we would be able to validate that that registration process would work smoothly for them. Here, you can see that we skipped a lot of those navigation steps with that one visit URL step and cleaned this test up really nicely. Next point is thinking about the speed that it takes, the time and effort that it takes to edit and maintain test cases. Very simple question. Which would you rather edit a test with 250 steps or only 50 steps? By focusing your tests and using some of the strategies that we just previously mentioned, you're actually able to use less steps in a test, making it so that if you ever need to make changes, edit it, it allows you to work on a much more focused, fewer sets of steps so that it's a lot easier of a process. Finally, want to talk about the value. Now, this might not seem related to speed of test creation, but the more value that you get out of a test, the more information you have to then either edit the test as needed or start working on another test, or maybe you just get information a lot faster. So this first point, fast execution time, the fewer steps that are in a test, the faster you will get back the result of whether it's working or not. So if you rate a really focused test, you get much faster feedback from that that allows you to do either other things, maybe make another test or edit it as needed. With less steps to review, each time that that test actually does execute, there's fewer steps that you need to look through to actually validate or isolate what that issue was that happened. And finally, focused tests make for focused failures. This is one thing that I really want to emphasize here because it adds a lot of value to those tests that you're creating. If we are skipping that navigation to get to, let's say, that checkout page or that adding the item to the cart, that means that if those pieces of functionality were to break, our tests will still provide value because they don't interact with it. If I have a test specifically for navigation and a test that skips that navigation and then tests functionality that's further down a customer's process or flow, then when those tests execute, I'm not going to get multiple failures because the navigation was broken. I will still know that if the navigation was working and a customer could get to the checkout page, that they would actually be able to fully check out and buy the products that we were trying to sell. So that's one example of many ways in which you can get a lot more value out of that and speed up the actual process that you're trying to interact with by knowing more of what issues are actually happening as opposed to issues potentially getting masked by others. It allows you to get a lot more feedback and be able to act on that and be able to make more tests in that process.
Great. So hopefully that gave you some good information and concepts to consider as you work to create focus tests in Mabel. And just to leave you with some takeaways and reiterate the items we touched on here this afternoon. So we hope overall this has really helped you learn about a few ways to help expedite your test creation. So remember that flows allow you to quickly add in pre-made sets of functionality to test certain actions. You don't have to do something another team member has already done, and they're very easy to maintain since editing a flow in a single test will update across all other tests where it's being used. We encourage you to use data-driven testing to speed up test creation by starting a test with pre-existing variables and making it super easy to add a new test case by simply adding additional input data. And remember to focus your test and utilize some of the strategies that Damon walked you through, such as using API steps, visit URL steps, and really focusing your assertions. And with focus tests, right, you'll ultimately have faster maintenance and get more value from your test executions. So with that, we thank you all for your time, and we'll go ahead and open it up to any questions.
Terrific. Thank you both. We do have a couple of questions here, so let me see if I can grab the first one for you. Can you share some best practices for tagging or naming flows?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, go.
Yeah, I'll jump in here and you can add anything. Yeah, naming convention is super important, not only when we think about flows, but tests, really everything you're naming in Mabel in general. But we really want it to be a nice name that truly identifies what the flow is accomplishing. So it's easy for other teammates to understand what the flow is accomplishing and be able to import it into their test. So at the end of the day, it's really all up to the organization on what works best for you in terms of naming convention, but something that we have seen in the past that works well is something like application module action. So that could be a naming convention for you to consider if you don't already have something solidified internal.
That's the only. That was beautiful. The only thing that I would potentially add would be the concept of like if you're adding a parameter or something, maybe you can add that into the name as well so people understand that it's a parameterized flow. Within the trainer, you can see that information by hovering over the flow on the import page. But I think that naming convention that Mary Kate just outlined will work in almost every single situation that you're working with.
Terrific. Thanks for that addition there, Damon. Another question that's come in here. Let's see. Are you planning to add the possibility to use data tables and flows? I used the same flow in one test several times, in other words, looping. And I would like to use it in different scenarios.
Yeah, so I'm going to grab that one if it's okay. That actually speaks to, so when we talk about a parameterized flow, what that actually is to some degree a data-driven flow. So a data-driven test right now is a test that uses variables that have their values that can be overridden. In the same example with the parameterized flow, they have variables that are unique to that flow that have default values, but that can also be overridden. So you can even add one flow into the same test multiple times and have it use different values in each instance of that flow in that one test. So I would definitely take a look more at parameterized flows. I think that will accomplish what you're looking for.
Great. The next question we have, Data-driven testing is useful as input data to the test, but how do we use it for data-driven assertions? In other words, user X is the input, they live in the USA is the assertion in the back end, but that's what also needs to show up in the UX.
Yeah. So in a similar vein, like any value that you're putting into the test that you're entering can be a variable, but you also have the ability to assert against values using variables. So you can do it a couple different ways. But if it's an element in the page that has certain inner text, you can compare that to the value of a variable. You also have the ability to put a couple different variables together if it's maybe a longer string of text and be able to dynamically build that based off those variable values. So one example would be like if you have that login flow that I was showing before, and I put in a certain value for the variable, I can then also use that same variable in an assertion on the next page that states that that email is now being displayed because that's how that's the email that I logged in with. So I would take a look at utilizing those variable values within those assertions that you're looking to do and give that a shot.
Great. So the next question might be a little easier than the last two. How many flows in my application is good practice?
I'll jump in here. So it's not really about how many, it's about how they're being used. So there honestly isn't a correct number to use, right? If a flow exists to do a certain action that you're trying to build a test to do or include that particular action, then you of course should use the flow. And tests are going to vary in length. So there's really not a correct number to use, but going back to what Damon talked about when we think about focusing tests, you really want to try to limit the number of steps overall in a test, not even specific to how many flows you're using, and keep it focused and really only test what's critical to that particular end-to-end behavior or actions that you're testing.
Great, thank you, Mary Kate. We have a couple more questions here. If anybody has any additional questions, feel free to submit them whenever you're ready. So the next question, are your execution results integrated with other tools and apps like Jira, Qtest, etc.?
I'll grab that one. So our execution results, when executing in the cloud, we have a number of different integrations that we can work with. What is nice though, so we have some that are kind of default if you're looking with Jenkins. A lot of those tools will automatically import the results of those tests based off of just the integration that you use. But even still, even if you're not using that, if you're triggering a deployment, Mabel actually has an API that you can call with the deployment any deployment ID to get an actual output of all of those of the actual test results. So if you're looking to integrate that with a tool, there is a way to utilize that API call to get the data that you'd need to kind of be able to customize whatever integration you'd be looking to set up.
Terrific. The next question we have here, on average, how much faster can leveraging data tables and flows make my test creation?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. So I don't have, I'd say, specific numbers to share. So it really depends on how you define speed of test creation. So if you're looking at how quickly you can create a test using data tables and flows, the answer is it'll somewhat improve the speed. But if you think about the number of tests you can complete in a period of time, you're going to see that it dramatically speeds up your test creation. So some of the practices that we shared will slow you down at first. Like Damon mentioned, it's a slow down to speed up. But once you have things like data tables and flows implemented, you're going to see a lot of time savings after the fact.
Yeah, I think Andrew, I saw one of our sales engineers, Andrew, he was talking earlier about building blocks, and I think flows work really nicely as building blocks. Once you have them, you just kind of put them together, and it allows you to create that much faster. So I want to give him a quick shout out, and I really liked his analogy of building blocks for flows. So that's something to think about.
Great. So it looks like we're going to take one more question here and then we'll wrap up. And hopefully I'm not throwing you a curveball here, Damon and Mary Kate, but the question is, does Mabel support multiple data tables in a single test?
Yes. It depends on what you're thinking though. So if you can have multiple data tables set up with one test, but it's not but you can't define different variables in each. So if I have two data tables and I've got both, let's say I'm going to use that login example from earlier. I can have a data table that has like the admin user and a standard user in one data table and the variables username and password. If I wanted to add a second data table to that, that wouldn't be there to add in more variables to the test. That would be there to add in more scenarios to the test. So I could then have in like a viewer or an editor or an owner, different permissions. And that could be a different data table. But by associating both of those, one with 3 scenarios, one with 2 scenarios, what would end up happening is that test would then run all 5 scenarios that those 2 data tables defined. Hopefully that answers your question, and always feel free to reach out to support if you've got any, if there is more to that answer that you were looking for.